Davey, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now, the judge who heard the evidence of how 3 particularly odious individuals in Derby burned 6 children to death decided today she needed another 24 hours to decide what jail sentences to give them. The sentence of the media in the Philpott case is resounding, though, and so are the many questions. Inevitably, there's a bit of the usual social worker bashing, and bigger questions too are raised. Why were the children living with their shameless parents? And that raises questions about the rights of the individual and the assumption that anyone entitled to have as many children as they choose can expect the state to pay for their upkeep. Why? Zoe Conway reports.
What was life like for Jade, John, Jack, Jessie, Jaden and Dwayne Philpott? Their parents, who killed them, say they led happy lives. Social services have said they were not at risk. But should more have been done to protect these 6 children? Today it became clear that their father had a long history of violence. The judge at Nottingham Crown Court, who will sentence Mick Philpott, his wife Mairead and their friend Paul Mosley tomorrow, heard that Philpott was jailed for 7 years in 1978 for the attempted murder of an ex-girlfriend and for attacking her mother. In 1991 he headbutted a colleague, and last year he pleaded guilty to common assault in a road rage incident.
Listen, you want to start? You start! You start! Keep back here!
His aggression was given an audience on daytime TV.
Let's get Lisa. Lisa's on the show, ladies and gentlemen.
And when his mistress was invited to join him and his wife to talk about their unconventional sex life, there was fascination and disgust. But apparently social services didn't think it was time to intervene.
Anybody who's willing to expose themselves in the way that Mr. Philpott and his family were willing to expose themselves on the Jeremy Kyle show and elsewhere, that there clearly was something dysfunctional. Whether that dysfunction was such that the children required urgent action to protect them, that's quite a different issue. There are lots of dysfunctional families where there are not the grounds, there's not the evidence, and sometimes indeed there's not the requirement or the need to remove the children from those families.
Whether social services should have paid more attention to what was going on inside the Philpott home is now the subject of an official review. But they're not the only part of the state under scrutiny.
Hello, I'm Anne.
Hello, Anne. I'm Mick. Pleased to meet you.
Very pleased to meet you too.
Former Conservative Minister Anne Widdecombe met Mick Philpott 6 years ago as part of a documentary about Britain's welfare culture.
The benefit system allowed Mick Philpott to live as he did, and he lived very well. There were cars in the front drive or cars in the front of the house. There was a huge adventure playground for the children behind the house. There was karaoke equipment, etc. in the house. There was no shortage of material possessions. Conditions were very cramped because he was having, at the stage that I went there, 2 children a year, 1 by each woman.
What is your reading of the relationship between the welfare state and what actually happened?
That he was allowed to be work shy and blatantly so, and to get away with it. Yes, all that's down to the welfare state. But the act of wickedness and recklessness which caused him to place 6 of his own children in danger with what results we saw, that was nothing to do with the welfare state. That came from Mick Philpott's own character.
But for the Daily Mail, the fate of the Philpott children and a benefit system that was designed to protect them cannot be so easily separated.
Well, I think this is a case where the 6 children died as a tragic result of our having a benevolent benefit system. And I think that a crueler system would have saved those children's lives. That's the awful paradox of this case. Because there wouldn't have been such an incentive for a man like Philpott to have 17 children in the first place. And had he had 17 children in Sweden or Denmark, something would have been done to stop a figure like that being in charge of them. They would have been put into a state institution or they would have been sent out for adoption.
Mick and Mairead Philpott were found guilty on the day that the government defended its welfare reforms. Ministers have been trying to make the case that the welfare state is at its cruelest when it traps a family on benefits.
Now, Andrew Webb is the president of the Association of Directors of Children's Services and also director of Children's Services at Stockport Council. Harriet Sergeant is a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies and has investigated how the welfare state can influence people's behaviour. Mr. Webb, Is it necessarily the case that children living in large numbers, in the sort of conditions we've heard about, inadequate bedrooms and the rest of it, are damaged by the experience?
There's no evidence to suggest that large families are bad for children, no. And if you have a large family in a small house, you necessarily, things are cramped. The specific issues faced by this family need to be explored by the local Safeguarding Children Board, and it has set up a review which will report later this year, and will look at very carefully at all the issues facing the family before and leading up to.
I understand
this
you can't
event.
talk specifically in detail about this case because much of it is yet to come out. But if children were in the care of the state, would the state allow these sort of conditions to be those in which they lived?
Well, the state wouldn't necessarily try and keep several children in a small house. No, it's an odd question to ask. I think the question, should the state have intervened, depends on whether the children were suffering harm in their life prior to their tragic death.
Obviously what I'm getting at is that if it's not acceptable for children in care to live under these cramped and very odd circumstances, why is it acceptable for children who are not in the care of the state?
Well, our legal system works on the principle that parents look after their own children, and for most parents, most of the time, they do a very good job, and the criteria for becoming involved are not simply those to do with overcrowding. We actually have to demonstrate, if we're going to intervene in a family against the parents' wishes, that any child is suffering or likely to suffer significant harm, and that's a test that's been set by the courts, and case law has examined the detail of what significant harm looks like, and that's how the law stands in the country today.
And you find it adequate, do you?
The Children Act of 1989 has been functioning very well for the last 20 years.
More questions should have been asked?
I don't know which questions were asked. That's for the serious case review to look at. All
these children, women, bed hopping, the whole thing?
There's no evidence to suggest that unusual lifestyles should lead to children being separated from their parents.
Why not?
Well, there isn't evidence of significant harm. If there's evidence of harm to children, then the state can act. But this is a matter for government. If it wanted to impose a set of moral judgments on top of the judgments about harm that we currently use, it would have to change the law.
Someone's going on television boasting about this lifestyle. That doesn't constitute neglect.
Well, not necessarily, no. You have to understand the nature of the parenting the child receives, and the engagement of this family by the media is quite bizarre in my
opinion.
Something that the state should step in to act on.
Harriet Sergeant, you've heard there what the clear role of the state is, that no judgment is passed on the way that parents lead their lives as long as there's no evidence of neglect.
Well, I did a report on the care system, so I've seen quite how spectacularly the care system fails children that are taken into care.
Not all children who are taken into care, some.
The vast majority. I mean, the vast majority. I mean, so out of 60,000 children that are taken into care, only I think 60 get to university. So,
that's rubbish.
This is a large number. So I don't think taking these children into care was the answer. Also, I think this is slightly missing the point. I mean, we're not actually saying whether these children were neglected. There are plenty of children that were neglected. They were living in a very eccentric lifestyle. But the point is how the state was affecting the way that why this was happening. I mean, the fact that Philpott was getting £60,000 a year from the state because of his children. Now, I was talking to a man today who looks after vulnerable children, for which he's given a very meagre, and he is having to pay tax.
So you want to stop child benefit, do you?
Yes, he's paying tax so that Philpott can be in the top 1% of earners, which is what his salary would take him before
So
tax.
what would you say? People can't
I mean, that is a ridiculous system. I mean, why is someone
That's your opinion, but
paying tax on very little for someone like Philpott?
they're paying for the child, as you well know, and the money, generally speaking, goes to the mother.
Well, it certainly wasn't in Philpott's case. I mean, the reason why he was so
extracted
upset...
it from vulnerable women. But we can't talk too much about this particular case because we don't know all the facts. But your broader point about the payment of child benefit, you'd restrict it, would you?
It's not just child benefits, it's also tax credits.
Okay,
I mean,
right. So
let's remember these two women were both working.
How many kids should people be allowed to have before the state gives them anything?
I think people should have 2 children, and I don't quite understand why they're getting child benefit after that.
Can you explain that, please, Mr. Webb?
Explain the benefit system.
And can you explain why somebody is entitled to carry on breeding indefinitely and expect the state to pay for their children?
Well, the welfare benefit system has been under review. If the government wished to change it, it's had ample opportunity over the last few months to look at this issue. Poverty for children is pernicious, and one of the worst things we can do in society is allow children to live in poverty. And
all right.
Unless you
engage with that, Harriet.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have a rise of child poverty in this country, even though we are paying benefits, but we have a rise of child poverty. And why is that? The reason is that it's because we have increasing numbers of very young single mothers having children. And this is, again, a problem caused by the state. We have young women coming out of schools. I mean, I've just done a report, so I've been interviewing quite a number of these young women. They're coming out of schools where they are with no qualifications whatsoever, out of very poor state schools. Then the only way that they can have an independent existence is by having children. I think this is a perfectly sensible financial decision on their part.
All right.
But this is caused by the state.
I'm going to have to cut across you both there because sadly we've been disrupted by North Korea, so we've run out of time. Thank you both. Well, that's, I'm afraid, all we have time for. Until tomorrow, good night.